Hey y'all, my name's Mary Leah, and I'm doing my project on the comparative anatomy and physiology of the vertebrate tongue. So, I want to start with a little bit of introduction. So, mouth anatomy is a key innovation in the evolution of terrestrial lifestyle. And with this, I think morphology of the tongue reveals a lot of information about evolutionary pressures. It's a feeding mechanism, it's a communication mechanism, it's an immune organ. And all of these are pretty necessary for the survival of a species. And so, tongue anatomy and physiology can provide a lot of information about those evolutionary pressures and timetables of various animal species. So, for some background with the structure remains pretty consistent among mammals and many other species. The positioning is related to the hyoid bone, which kind of comes underneath the muscles. There are four extrinsic muscles which move the tongue directionally, and four intrinsic muscles that change the shape of the tongue. So rich blood supply, lymphatic drainage, and nerve innervation like any muscle. And the muscles are anchored by tissue and covered in a mucosal lining. There are also three types of taste buds on the tongue: fungiform, filiform, and valate. They detect the five core tastes, which are sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. So this diagram kind of shows some of the different structures and papillae on the surface of the tongue. And then here is a list of some of those major anatomical structures, like muscles, nerves, blood vessels, and lymphatics. Not going to go through every single one of these, but I think it goes to show the complexity of the innervation of such a small organ and the vascularization and whatnot. And then finally, this picture again just shows you the complexity, and there's a lot going on in that small area of your mouth. And just kind of seeing glands, bones, muscles, lymphatic ducts, blood vessels, nerves, all the good stuff, all right there. So the function I think we're all most familiar with is the motor function of the tongue. This is mastication, food intake and swallowing, as well as speech and sound control. Food intake and communication are both very important to the structure and survival of species, which makes them important evolutionary pressures throughout history. And then humans, which is no surprise, have a very high motor capability of the tongue. And this is likely due to the complexity of speech that we possess. The areas of the brain that mediate tongue and hand motor control are actually highly interconnected, which I think gives a lot of insight to the complexity of the fine motor skills in the tongue and the hand, which are both pretty useful to us every day. And then another function we're familiar with is the sensory function of the tongue. There is a higher density of sensitive peripheral touch receptors in the mucosa of the tongue than other parts of the body. These taste bud receptors are clusters of nerve cells that transmit information about those five core tastes. And the taste receptors actually also have a protective role. There is a much higher density of bitter receptors than other tastes, and this is to alert an animal about poisonous or rotten food that could be toxic to them. So I think it's interesting that the tongue has this, and taste have this protective role as a sense. One myth, I didn't know this before I did my research, but that certain areas of the tongue or certain taste buds are responsible for a specific taste. This is not true. Actually, all taste buds can detect the five core tastes and send that information up to the brain to interpret. Another function that I think we're a little less familiar with is the immune function of the tongue. Of course, there's an epithelium and a mucosal lining that act as a barrier against pathogens and allergens, but the epithelial cells are actually activated by the immune system in a similar manner to the activation of intestinal cells upon infection. There are also macrophages, dendritic cells, mast cells, and lymphocytes that have been detected in the tongues of healthy animals across a variety of species. And then interesting to me is that taste receptors actually contain TLR4, which can activate the hair trigger and start and stop immune responses specifically within the tongue. I think a good feature that a lot of us noticed during the COVID-19 pandemic is that there's a loss of taste and smell due to diseases like COVID-19, which if that doesn't illustrate an immune interaction with the tongue, I don't know what could. This, like I said, I found the TLO4 connection very, very interesting. And that TLO4 is found in the taste receptors, and it actually mediates fat, sugar, and umami preference. So, in a study where they did a TLO4 knockout mutation in mice, these mice ended up with a reduced preference for fatty and sugary foods, which actually resulted in diminished weight gain as well as weight loss. So, it's very interesting to see the immunomodulatory effect that the tongue has in regards to weight, obesity, a lot of things like that that could have some pretty interesting research applications. So finally, some comparative anatomy of the tongue, since that is this class. Just some features about different animals to kind of give you a scope of the differences in morphology that have resulted from evolutionary pressures. So in amphibians, there is no keratinization and no separation from the lingual epithelium. They have secretory granules that secrete a substance similar to saliva. And in frogs, actually have a very soft and sticky tongue. That's very good for shock absorbing and catching prey. As you can see in this picture, and I'm sure we all know, frogs kind of hunt with their tongues, I guess, which is very interesting function and adaptation. So for this purpose, they have very soft and sticky tongues. In birds, they are keratinized, especially along the lingual nail, which is kind of a ridge. Many also have backward-facing barbs to aid in transporting that food down the esophagus. And some of them have a pretty extreme extension ability. So you can see in this photo of this hummingbird below, we know that's how they eat by getting nectar from flowers. So that is just another functional adaptation of the tongue. And then I thought I should include fish as they don't possess a true tongue. They have no voluntary muscles, and it's really just a slight elevation of the mucosa at the bottom of the mouth. This is interesting because the lack of a tongue in fish is one of those evolutionary aspects that have determined that it may have been an adaptation for tetrapods and for eating on land. Um, so found that kind of interesting. And then finally, reptiles. Reptiles have very diverse habitats, so very diverse adaptations of their tongues. They commonly have stratification and keratinization of the lingual epithelium. In fact, snakes use their tongue for olfaction rather than mechanical food intake. This means they have a high concentration of lipid granules in which to capture smells and a forked tongue to increase surface area. Yet again, another fascinating adaptation and function of the tongue. And then, of course, mammals, kind of what we were talking about the rest of the presentation. And I think we're all a little bit more familiar with the mammal tongue, less fun facts regarding that. But overall, tongues are very different in different species, and they're specifically adapted to their environment and diet and communication needs. One commonality between across really all land-dwelling species is that keratinization of the tongue is more common in animals living in dry or seawater habitats. This is likely a protection aspect for that mucosal lining, maybe kind of a hydration aspect as well. But importantly, or most importantly, kind of what I've been saying this whole time is that tongue anatomy offers some very valuable evolutionary insight. Like I said, the lack of a true tongue in fish suggests that the organ evolved for food intake in terrestrial animals, as well as a communication aspect, since that's a little less or a little more difficult underwater. But yeah, I hope y'all found this presentation interesting. Please let me know if you have any questions. And finally, here are my references. Thank you.